Good evening. My name is Cassidy Cook, and I chose to continue understanding the topic of women of color who are incarcerated. I felt like I don't really, or I hadn't really figured out how to get proximate yet. Of course, the first thing I would always want to do is just, jump into a prison and hear their stories, kind of like I see in documentaries. But that's not always feasible, and that's probably not the best way to get proximate at this moment for me. So I've always been interested in understanding women's prisons, the crimes committed by women, and the need for rehabilitation services. I've always had interest in documentaries, like I said, in television, just understanding like why women get to prison. Except when I started seeing it becoming more and more visual on social media and in documentaries and on television, I started focusing more on women of color who have been incarcerated. Because it seems like from a lot of stories that have been shared, a lot of women receive very harsh sentences for what can be a relatively small crime, or a crime that they committed when they were very young and are still in prison 30, 40 years later. So that's something that I wanted to look into more. So the issues with incarcerated women of color, in my opinion, this is my argument, stems back to societal norms where those who are not of the majority, who are not white, have greater disadvantages. And this goes back to the article that we read in class, or online, I should say, which was Aliens in the Education Matrix, Recovering Freedom. So the author in that article talks a lot about how educational systems have a direct effect on a person's life, on what they're taking away from school, their opportunities, and how school systems who live in poor neighborhoods don't have as much access to resources and opportunities. So for me, I link that to women of color who have been incarcerated. Of course, not all women of color who are incarcerated come from poverty-stricken neighborhoods, but they do, for the most part, have societal disadvantages based on the color of their skin. So that's what I looked into more. I first started gaining more of an interest in understanding women of color when I learned about Centoya Brown. Centoya Brown was a woman of color who at the age of 16 was working as a prostitute and went to a man's home. She didn't feel safe and felt very uncomfortable, and ended up ultimately killing the man at 16 years old. And she received a very hefty sentence. It was only this year that she was released, and she was released because celebrities started sharing her story and giving more information about what happened to her, because it kind of seemed like she had just been left behind. So people like Rihanna, Kim Kardashian, they all fought for her. Unfortunately, she was able to get out now. I don't know exactly how many years she did spend in jail, but it was about 20 years, I believe. So this is important for our society because of their stories, and celebrities are the ones that sharing that. So I think that that's important to recognize as well, because phones are right in our hands at all times, and we always have access to it, and it's important for people to begin sharing stories in a way that's going to be received by the most people. So there's a lot of other advocates that are fighting for women's rights, particularly in prison. There are movements like the Black Lives Matter, which is fighting for less police brutality, equal rights within the justice system, for all races. It's not just Black lives. And then also the women's right movement, even though it's not directly related to women of color, they're fighting for reproductive rights, and the rights for incarcerated women to have relationships, and the opportunity to care for their children. Another one is the Innocence Project. For people who have been wrongfully convicted, a lot of the people that have helped them have come from the Innocence Project, and that's really like a group of people. They have centers and clinics all over the country, where they take a case, they review it, and then they choose if they will have an argument to potentially get that person out of jail. So that's been very helpful. The Federal Bureau of Prisons tracks prison demographics and updates these statistics monthly. So I did check today, and 37.5% of incarcerated women in women's prisons are women of color, while 58.6% are white. This was very interesting to me because the way that it seems is that, women of color are occupying more spaces in prisons, but that's actually not the case. So that was interesting for me to read, especially from the readings that we've read in class, mostly talking about education, but then also linking it back to if you don't receive a good education, then that, especially if you're in a poverty-stricken neighborhood, there's more likelihood for you to either go to jail or commit a crime or not have access to a better education, and that kind of sets you behind, especially for people who are able to get those educations, get those jobs, things like that. So I had to really think about my topic and kind of narrow it down more. So I'd like to continue to focus on women of color from poverty-stricken neighborhoods and understanding the injustices that they encounter, as well as the systems that have brought them to prison. Of course, a lot of them do commit the crimes that they have been accused of, but there's also people who come from bad neighborhoods, come from lack of opportunity and things like that for whatever reason. And because of that, they feel that, they have to commit these crimes either to support their families. A lot of them maybe have children, support themselves, or even just to survive. So that was something that I thought would be important in my argument. So when thinking of what could be done differently, there's definitely more resources that need to be provided to women who are from these types of neighborhoods that don't have much support, don't have a whole lot of resources. And by bringing more access to services for women of color in these neighborhoods, there's more potential to have less incarceration, more opportunities for them to receive an education or a stable career, and could also decrease the need for the foster care system, because you watch documentaries and so many of them left their children either with the foster care system or with their own family if they had that, and many of them don't. So while these are all extreme possibilities, they're very possible. So think about how I can get involved in working with women of color who are incarcerated. The first thing I said, I want to do is just jump in and go to a jail, go to a prison. But that is not feasible. It does scare me also to think about being surrounded by women who have committed these types of crimes. I think I could, however, volunteer in places like women's shelters. These places are all over. There are not enough, but there are, some. You can see that there is an effort to get more support out there. So I think by volunteering there and getting to know the people who maybe have gone to prison or do come from those types of neighborhoods who have not had the same opportunities as people who come from suburban areas or more wealthy areas, I think that would be very important. And I would also be able to understand their life circumstances a little bit more based on where they grew up, how they grew up, family support, family dynamics, all of that stuff. So there's so much that can be done for women of color in prisons across the United States. This includes volunteering when and if possible, donating books and educational materials, donating female toiletries, and serving as a pen pal. There's lots of different things that we can do, but most importantly, people need to continue to recognize the need for policy change regarding sentencing, the juvenile justice system, and equal opportunities for people of color. So these arguments are growing in speed, but there's still more work that can be done. So for me, getting proximate right now, I think, is learning a little bit more and understanding from the perspective of educational systems, like we've been talking about a lot in class, understanding how that has affected someone's life who is a woman of color who has or is currently incarcerated. So I hope this is interesting to you. I know it is for me. And if you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.